Hello, everybody. Welcome to Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 1. If you notice in the chat box, our co-host let you inform you that your webinar, this recording, will be sent to your email within 24 to 48 hours after the webinar. She also put some links to our website and the place where we archive this webinar and other webinars on our website. So, and also our website has other resources. So that's helpful for you to check that out. Just a few things before we get started. I just want to really quickly tell you, I'm going to scroll to the very end. That's our contact information. This is who we are, Statistics Solutions. We're a full service dissertation consultation service. You know, we help you basically usher whatever you sign up for, chapters, the whole thing. We basically help you develop your chapters to get approved. And we also offer assistance with statistics, editing. So it's really, if you're interested or potentially interested in what we're doing, and if it's right for you, a consultation would be the way to go. Free consultation, just to see if you know, there's no obligation, just to see if what we offer is right for what you need. Okay, and I will have this back up the contact information at the end. Okay, so let's get started. If you have questions, as we will have a question and answer session at the end. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free to jot them down, or feel free to put them in the question and answer box, or even in the chat box. But we won't get to them until the end. All right, so let's get going. So our conceptualization of the dissertation is based on pretty standard 5-chapter model, with chapter 1 being in the introduction, chapter 2 being the literature review, chapter 3 being the methodology, chapter 4 being the presentation of your findings or your results, and chapter 5 being the discussion of the results. Now there are some differences to that model. I mean, sometimes they're, especially international schools, sometimes we'll have you know, 6 chapters, which the last chapter is split into 2. So there are differences, but usually the features are pretty similar. So that's kind of the model that we work from, which is pretty standard again. So the chapter 1 is the introduction. And just to kind of give you an overview, and this is what we're going to be covering today, which is fairly typical of features that are common in chapter 1's, the introduction. Just to pull back, what the chapter 1 is and what its purpose is. I mean, it's really kind of a blueprint for the study, if you think about it that way. When your reader is done reading chapter 1, they should know, 3 fundamental things about your study. The what, the why, and the how, right? So the what, your topic, what are you going to be researching? What are you going to be studying? The why are you going to be doing it, right? What drives the need for the study? Why is the study needed? And the how, this is the methodology, which is going to be worked out much more fully in chapter 3 later, but usually there's some kind of mention and some kind of discussion of the methodology in chapter 1. So that's the how. So the what, why, and the how. And again, kind of like a blueprint, right, for what you're going to be doing, how you're going to be doing it, and the reason for doing it. Okay, that typically contains these areas here. I say this at the beginning, and I'm going to say it probably several times throughout the presentation. Always get a hold of your school's template for the dissertation, for the chapters. It will tell you what is required, usually what is required for the dissertation, what is required in the chapters, what is required in the sections in the chapters. So that's really helpful for you, but professors usually go right to the template when they're checking your work, right? So one of the first things they do is to see, well, did you provide this, what the template said? Well, if you didn't, that's pretty easy for them to count down for that. So you want to follow your template, your school's template. If they don't have one, sometimes schools don't. Try to get an example of an approved study from your school, from your chair, maybe. We do have, and this webinar represents a kind of a general chapter 1, which works. If you don't have one, your school doesn't have one, we have templates on our website that will work. They're general, but usually they can be adapted, or they work fine as they are. But always, if you can, obtain your school's guidelines, because there may be small differences. Okay, so these are the sections that are typical in the chapter 1 we're going to be covering today. All right, so let's get going. The introduction. This is the introduction to the introduction, right? So really, like an introduction, it's not too involved. You just want to kind of get, orient the reader. What are you going to be studying, right? And you're going to answer a little bit of why and a little bit of how, but those things get answered much more in depth later on. So what you want to do is, usually studies proceed from some kind of problem, right? I mean, that's kind of the reason for doing them, right? If everything's okay, you don't need to study something, right? So usually studies stem from some kind of organizational problem or some kind of social problem. Like it could be, attrition in some area, like special education teachers leaving the profession, right, at record numbers, or nursing shortage. If you're doing an education study, declining grades in a certain population or a certain area of study, right? So usually there's some kind of a problem that your study is based on. So you want to start off, with what the problem is, right? Include the social or organizational problem. Use some kind of statistics or even a supported source, a citation to get the reader's attention, right? To show the scope of the problem. If it's declining grades, then use some evidence to show those declining grades and whatever it is you're talking about, whatever population. or again, you can use some kind of an observation, but as long as it's anchored with a citation, right? You need to show evidence that you can point to. It's not just like your opinion that, hey, there's a problem in this area, right? So you have to have evidence that you can actually point to. So open with that. You want your statistics or your source to be recent, right? So if you point to a problem that was 10 years ago, that may not be a problem anymore, or the problem may have changed, or the numbers have changed, right? The statistics are different now than they were 10 years ago. So use something recent. Then you want to talk a little bit about introduce the research problem. Okay, we have the social problem. The research problem is related, it's a little different. So now that we have this problem, what kind of research is there on it, right? There's usually been some research done on it, but maybe not the kind that you're proposing or from the specific angle that you're proposing. So introduce the research problem, and we'll get to what a research problem is in a few slides. But why is there an issue in the research? What is the issue in the research? Why is the study needed? Introduce that. State what is needed to address the research problem, how your study is designed to address the research problem. So, and this is not a long section, it's probably about a page, all right? Because you're not really getting in depth about things, you're kind of putting them on the table and say, hey, this is what my study is going to be about, here's why. At the end of the section, the reader should know what you're studying and why. And again, this is all going to be worked out as you go along in more detail. And if you want, you can end with a preview of the sections of the chapter. Like this chapter will contain sections on A, B, C, D, E. And again, if your template says something a little different, then follow your template. But this is a pretty good general guide. After the introduction, the next section is usually the background. It kind of flows out of the introduction, right? So this is where you have to kind of get your reader up to speed on the problem and the research that's been conducted on the problem. So let's just say it is you are doing an education study, and it's on why there's so many special education teachers leaving the field, right? It's a problem. They're understaffed, right? So what, you want to start off with a little bit of the background on the problem. When did it start to become a problem? How has it evolved over time? So you want to trace the kind of the development of the problem, right? And these are kind of historical, right? You're gonna have some background material. It's kind of broad strokes. You don't need to get into a lot of detail at this point, because that will happen in the literature review in chapter 2, where you start looking at the research on the topic and getting into what people found and the kind of measurements they used and things. But now it's kind of a broad strokes historical. You're looking at trends in the development of the problem to where it stands today. And most people are okay with that, but you also want to remember in this background section, it's not just research on the problem. It's not just research on the problem, it's research on the problem, if that makes sense. So not just where the problem has been and how it's developed, but how research has addressed the problem over time. So again, what are some of the trends in the research? What is research focused on in the past? Then where did it go? And then where is it now? So you want to give kind of like a usually this is sections ordered chronologically, kind of chronological narrative of the problem, where it's been, where it stands, and the same about the research on the problem. Okay. Focus on major trends in the research, what is known about the topic. And then if you think of it kind of as a funnel, it kind of funnels down to where the research stands on the topic today. And it should point to the gap, or it should point to your research problem and what is still needed on the topic. So this background is kind of a historical summary of the topic, the research on the topic, with an eye towards what's lacking in the research, right? And hence the need for your study. That's where the background kind of points to. And that takes us to the research problem. Okay, so first, let's just kind of make sure we're all on board with what a research problem is. It's kind of like it sounds. It's a problem in the research. That means, what does that mean? That means there's something unreconciled maybe in the research. There's something inconclusive in the research. There's something about the phenomenon or whatever topic it is you're studying that the research still hasn't resolved, that the research still hasn't, it may be addressed even. Maybe there's a gap in the research, and that's a kind of research problem. All right, research problems aren't always gaps, but they can be, right? We have a lot of information, but there's this one tiny area we don't know much about. That could be a gap in knowledge. So that could be a research problem. A research problem could be, we have a lot of qualitative research on a certain topic, a lot of information about people's experiences and their in-depth perceptions, but we don't have really much quantitative research that confirms the relationship between factors. Or it could be the reverse. We have a lot of quantitative data on test scores and things like that, but we don't have much qualitative data on what's going on underneath everything, what people are thinking about things. So that's a kind of research problem. So the research problem section, and to go back to the background just a minute, how long should the background section be? I mean, at least a few pages, probably, to kind of catch the reader up on what's going on with the topic in the research. The research problem is more focused, section is more focused. So it can be probably less than a page. And what this is it's kind of a more targeted overview of recent research on you don't have to get too historical. What is the research problem? And then you're gonna kind of show, here's some of the major research that's been done on the topic. Here's what we know to date. And again, it's a little more focused than the background. You specifically state what the research problem is. You want to specifically state that your study is designed to address the research problem. So you kind of you set up the gap, or you set up the issue or whatever the problem is in the research by showing some of the major research in the area. And in doing that, you want to highlight what is not in the research, and hence the need for your study. So let's just take an example. Let's say your research problem is a gap. There's a gap in the literature. We don't know something about a certain aspect of the topic, and that's what your study is going to cover. Well, a gap is something that is hard to describe because by definition, a gap doesn't exist, right? So, and this is the analogy that I got that I think is kind of helpful. If you think of a donut, right, and a donut hole, how do you describe a donut hole? It doesn't exist. I mean, it's right. So what you do is you describe the donut, and in describing donut, it frames the gap, right? So if you think of your research problem, if your research problem is a gap in the literature, the same way, I think that's helpful. How do you define a gap in the literature? Well, you show the research that's as close to what you're doing as possible, and then it helps to frame what's there, but it also helps to frame what's not there, and hence that's where your study would come in. Okay, that's the research problem. And another thing for these sections, use your resources, these webinars, the resources on our website, any other, resources that you can. But sometimes there's just no better help than a good example, so if you have an example from your school or that your chair sent you that they want you to follow, that's always a good idea, because you can see, concretely how somebody has handled some of these sections. Okay, usually the next section is the purpose. And again, it's not a long section. I mean, overall, I would say chapter ones typically are under 20 pages. 15 pages is probably the sweet spot. The purpose section, again, usually not long, maybe a paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs. And the purpose section includes the purpose statement, right? And the purpose statement is usually, it usually has a specific construction. Okay, and I have it here up at the top, includes the purpose statement. Okay, so let's review this. Excuse me. The purpose of this, the approach, the design study is to examine, explore. The verb is not so important. The concepts or variables in your sample setting. That's the kind of formula, right? That's the formula that your purpose statement should take. So let's take an example based on that. The purpose of this quantitative, that's your approach, correlational, that's your design in this example. Purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine the relationship between transformational leaders and emotional intelligence. Okay, those are your factors that you're studying in whatever sample and setting, in middle managers, in businesses in the Northeast, whatever your sample happens to be in your setting. So you see it has this very specific construction, which is helpful for you because you can just kind of, paint by numbers here. As far as the verb goes, for quantitative studies, typically examine, investigates, something like that. For qualitative studies that are typically a little more exploratory, you might want to use the verb explore, but the verbs are not so as important as the other parts. Let's just take the qualitative example here. The purpose of this generic qualitative, again, approach, design, study is to explore the challenges of African-American women as they advance to positions as university presidents in, again, whatever your sample happens to be and whatever your setting is. And that's the purpose statement. And it really kind of encapsulates what you're doing in your study. So once your purpose statement gets approved, your chair is okay with your purpose statement. I mean, until you get it locked down, it may shift a little bit, but once you get it locked down, you get kind of what you're doing nailed down and your purpose statement nailed down. Your purpose statement shouldn't change, right? So it's like your research questions. Once they're dialed in, they don't change. Same with your purpose statement. So anytime you need to refer to your purpose throughout the study, you can refer to it, your purpose statement, verbatim. In fact, you should, right? Because you don't want to go, kind of changing it to make it sound a little different because it's repetitive. And it's like, well, that changes what you're doing, right? If you change it. So, but this is the only time you got to pass the purpose statement and the RQs. That you can use them verbatim anywhere in the study. Professors don't like, just say you pull material from one section and use it in another chapter. They don't like that. But for the purpose statement and for the RQs, you should. Okay, and after the purpose statement usually starts off this purpose section. The purpose section may also include specific information about your variables. Here are the variables you're looking at. Here's how you're going to measure them. It might talk a little bit about the instruments you're going to use, some of the major concepts. Okay, so not a long section. Usually the research questions come next. This is not a methods seminar, so we're not going to talk about how to develop research questions, but they are covered in, we do run methods webinars. And if you're interested in how to develop research questions, you might want to attend one of those. But just to say that they're usually stated in this section of the chapter 1. Right. The next is usually the theoretical framework, and the theoretical framework is a little tricky for a lot of people. The first thing we need to do is talk about what a theoretical framework is, and then we also need to talk about what's the difference between a theoretical and a conceptual framework, because you've probably seen that term too, conceptual framework. Do you need one? Do you need both? What's the difference? I take a real practical approach to it, and let me see if I have it here. We do have a blog on the difference. Yeah, okay, I just put it in the webinar chat box. We do have a blog if you want to read it on the differences between theoretical and conceptual frameworks, and some resources that you could look at beyond that. Basically, I take a real practical approach. Theoretical frameworks are largely associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are largely associated with qualitative studies. And the reason for that is theoretical frameworks and quantitative studies typically work deductively. That means you're working from a general premise, right, or a general theory, or that the premise is within the theory, and then you're going to come to specific conclusions, because you're going to apply, you're going to test that theory essentially through your research questions and your instruments, and then you're going to from that general premise, that general theory, you're going to derive it specific conclusions. The conceptual framework and the qualitative study typically work inductively. So that means you're going to make general conclusions at the end based on specific details, and those specific details are specifics from your participants' interviews. You take those specifics, and then from there you make general conclusions based. So you don't want a theory in qualitative research, because you don't need a theory at the outset. You basically want the data and the participants' words to speak for themselves, right? So you don't want to overlay a theory on top of it at the beginning. So how to handle this section? What you want to do is you want to start off by defining your theory, right? So let's say let's just take an example. You're going to conduct a study on emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. You want to see if those two things are related. So sometimes it's easy to figure out your theories, right? Emotional intelligence and transformational leadership, that's what you're going to be studying. Well, your theories are going to be an emotional intelligence theory and a theory of transformational leadership. That's what's going to comprise your theoretical framework, those two theories together. So we just say something like the theory of emotional intelligence, the theory of transformational leadership will serve as the theoretical framework for the study. Then you would take each one separately. You would define emotional intelligence theory, talk about the components of it, define the components of the theory, because usually theories have tenets or components, and especially if you're measuring those components, you'll need to talk about them. You want to talk a little bit about what the theory was developed for, right? So theories are, what do theories do? Theories explain stuff. They help us explain things. So you want to talk a little bit about what the theory was developed to explain. You want to talk a little bit about how other researchers have used the theory. Then you want to talk a little bit about how it connects to your study. Okay, you do that for emotional intelligence, then you do it for transformational leadership, right? In our example, do the same thing. And so that would be, if you were doing that kind of study, that would be your theoretical framework, essentially. Now, another thing to keep in mind for a quant study, which is what we've been talking about the last couple minutes, your instrument and your theories needs to match. Okay, so what does that mean? So again, let's go back to our example, emotional intelligence. There are several instruments to measure emotional intelligence, right? There's not just one, there's a few. So you're going to select one, and you're going to select one that's most suited to get the information that you want. So, okay, let's just say you selected Goldman's instrument. Right? Goldman was someone who was a major figure in popularizing emotional intelligence. He has an instrument, and if you're using Goleman's instrument, right, when you go to talk about the theory in your theoretical framework, you want to use Goleman's theory, right? Because all instruments are based on theories. They all have theoretical foundations. They all come from somewhere, right? They don't just kind of develop them out of nothing. They base them on theories. So you want your instrument to match its theoretical foundation. So if you're using Goleman's instrument, the foundation is going to be Goleman's theory, right? So my point is, you don't want to use someone else's theory, like Smith, for example, Smith's theory for Goleman's instrument, right? You want your instrument and your theories to match. And that's important because, you know, theories will have, you think they're all the same. Well, they kind of are, but they may have different, they may have differences. They may have different components, right? One theory may have 3 components. One theory may have 4. And the instruments are going to be measuring those components usually. So that's another reason why you want your theory and your instruments to align, so the components align. All right. So for conceptual framework, it's pretty similar, except you're not using theories. And again, why aren't you using theories? Because the qualitative study typically works inductively, right? You don't need that theoretical overlay at the front end. So you use concepts, right? That's why it's called a conceptual framework. So you pull major concepts that you're looking at. So say you're looking at, to go back to our example from the purpose. Purpose is qualitative studies to explore the challenges African-American women face as they advance in positions as university presidents. So you don't want a theory for that. So you're going to take, for a conceptual framework, maybe the concept of advancement, or maybe barriers, right, to advancement. And you're going to use that concept as your conceptual framework. So you'd pull that concept out of the literature, define it as you want to define it for your study, but you know, couch that definition in the terms of the literature, and basically proceed the same way. You know, this concept of advancement, or, you know, barriers to advancement, will serve as a conceptual framework. Define it. Talk about how it's been used in the research, then talk about how it relates to your study. And also, what's important about the conceptual framework in relation to the qualitative study is that it will help guide your interview questions. Right. So if you're doing a qualitative study, you're doing interviews, you know, you just don't kind of make up the interview questions just randomly, right? So this goes back to your conceptual framework. That's why you get a concept that kind of encapsulates, you know, what you're looking at. You know, for our example, it was, you know, the barriers that these women face as they advance. So that once you get that concept down and that framework down, then you can pull from that a concept in the literature about some of what are the major ideas and some of the things that you want to hit on to ask in your interview questions. So the conceptual framework in that sense helps guide your interview questions. Again, the framework section is a little tricky. I think though, if you kind of do some research on it and look at some examples, it'll become a little more clear to you. Okay. Next, usually a section called Nature of the Study or the Study Design. And basically what this is, it's kind of a preview to the methodology chapter, right? You're going to mention your study design and your approach, and you're going to talk a little bit about it, which includes the rationale. Why did you select this design? Usually because it's the best design to get the kind of information you want, right? If you're looking at the relationship between factors, usually that's a correlational study. You know, some kind of cause and effect can be experimental. But anyway, usually there's some kind of rationale for the selection of your design. It usually summarizes other things about the methodology, like how data is going to be collected, how data is going to be analyzed. And again, yeah, more of this kind of methodological material we do cover in methodological webinars. So if you're interested in more on that, you might want to check out one of those. Definition section. Yeah, usually there's a section where you define the terms that are specific to your study. You define them, how they're going to be used for your study, right? So as far as other than the definitions, the entries for the definitions, the only content that usually needs to be here is something like the following terms are defined for use in this study, period. That's it. And then you go into your definitions. So what you want to, any kind of variables, factors you're looking at, you want to define, again, if you're looking at emotional intelligence, transformational leadership, they have components. You want to define those components. Any major concepts, you should define. Definition, I always recommend putting definitions in the form of sentences. Sometimes people put them in the form of phrases. I just put them in the form of sentences, so somebody doesn't come back and ask me later to say, hey, put these in the form of sentences. Definition should be clear and succinct, and this is important. I've sometimes seen people write things like, well, Smith says emotional intelligence means this, but Goldman says emotional intelligence means this, yet there's a third definition of this. And you have to remember that this definition section, it's not a discussion section, right? It's not where you discuss the terms. You want to define them. That's all you're doing. Defining them is you're going to be using for your study. So clear and succinct. Emotional intelligence refers to, emotional intelligence is, emotional intelligence will refer to, however you want to set it up. And then just give a clear definition of how you're going to use it for your study, supported with a source. These definitions can be one sentence long, sometimes two, but usually there's no reason for them to go on longer than that. Okay. Definitions should always be supported with peer-reviewed sources. Don't use dictionary definitions. It's too general. That's not, you need something from the literature, and it needs to correspond to how you're going to be using it in the study. So no dictionary definitions. Sources should be recent. That's not so important here, but throughout the chapter 1, except maybe in the background section, your sources should be as recent as possible. Unless your school doesn't have any requirements, but also remember you're doing a study of something now, right, in the present time. So sometimes what happened 20 years ago, if it's a foundational study, something that was studied 20 years ago could still have relevance, but usually not. Again, unless it's foundational for some reason. So you want to give a current snapshot of what's going on. So you want to use, again, throughout all the chapters, recent, as recent stuff as you can. The definitions, the sources don't have to be that recent. That's not so important here. Another thing is to alphabetize your entries, right? Just don't randomly put them in there, alphabetize them. Okay, I see we have a question. I'll come back to it at the end. And if we need to come back to this section, that'll be fine. Okay, the significance section, this is what professors like to call the so what section. Meaning, so you're doing a study on emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. So what? And it's a little glib, but by that, would they mean, how is that information going to be valuable, and who is it going to be valuable to? How is it going to contribute to the research? How is it going to advance the research? So it's kind of forward looking, but they want a section on this. They want you to, because studies, they're just not conducted for no reason. They generate information, they generate new knowledge, and that knowledge should be valuable, right? And usually there's two kind of prongs to this section, right? There's a value to research and value to practice. So value to research first, think about how your study is going to contribute to the literature, how it's going to contribute to the research. It may move, discussion of some topic forward. It may come at, the topic at an angle that people haven't really considered before. So these are the kinds of things you want to consider when you want to think about how your research might consider to the your research might contribute to the literature. Also, what is the value to practice, right? So what are the practical implications or significance? Let's say we are doing that study on why special education teachers leave the field. Well, who do you think that information would be valuable to? Certainly, special education teachers themselves, but probably administrators, right? I mean, administrators would see, oh, wow, they're leaving because they don't feel they're getting paid enough, or they're leaving because the demands are too high, for what they have to do. Okay, well, we can work to address that as administrators. So that's kind of the idea of this section. The value of your research, the research value, how it might contribute to the field, and the practical value, how it would inform people at the level of practice about what they do. Okay. Other sections I've kind of smushed together here because some schools have them, some schools don't, some schools have some of them. But usually there's a section to talk about limitations. And again, this is forward looking again, because you're not sure what the limitations are going to be until you actually conduct the study. But they want you to do a little forecasting, looking forward and to see what might be potential limitations, which are weaknesses or shortcomings that might affect your results. Obviously, when COVID was more, rampant, that threw a major wrench in doing studies, and it was a major limitation. Anything that sometimes you might have a risky population, and you might have, limitation might be that you can't actually get the participants that you want. You might have to use a proxy group. Any kind of thing that you can think of that might kind of get in the way, you want to talk about. Assumptions, and look some of these things up too if you don't know them, and we do have resources on our website, blogs and definitions and things. Assumptions are things that you have to take for granted, that you have to assume, that you don't have control over, right? And one of the big assumptions is that you have to assume that your participants are going to respond honestly to the best of their ability, because you don't have control over that, right? So you just have to assume that. Now you can help ensure that they do by, highlighting that their identities and their responses are going to remain anonymous and confidential. That helps ensure that they're going to answer honestly. But that's one of, that's an assumption. That's a major assumption that you have to make, that you can put in this section. Sometimes there's another section called scope or delimitations. And delimitations it's kind of confusing because it has the word limitations in there. But these are things that you can control. These are the boundaries that you've put on your study, right? And it's going to sound a lot like your purpose. It's going to talk, who are your participants, what's your setting, a lot of specifics like that that are in your purpose. It's like looking through a telescope or something. There's the material that you can see, that's what you're studying, and then there's the stuff outside of that, and that's beyond the scope of your study. Sometimes it's helpful if you're doing, say, like an education study and you're just looking at parents, right? You're just going to talk to parents, and and to put those boundaries there to say, yeah, I'm just looking at the responses of parents, not teachers, not administrators, not students. So that's what the scope and delimitation section is about. And usually in this section, they want you to talk a little bit, or sometimes in the limitations, the generalizability of your study. That means, you know, how likely are your results to generalize to the larger study population? If your study's quantitative, your results might generalize well, and there's things that affect that, like the sample size, right? You know, if your sample size is low, that's a limitation, because that decreases the statistical certainty of your results. If you have a low sample size, then that decreases your generalization too, because again, your statistical certainty is compromised. Things, sampling methods, random sampling helps increase your generalizability. If you're doing a qualitative study, your results won't generalize well, but they're not meant to. But it's worth saying that because qualitative studies have low sample sizes by design. You know, you're doing full-on interviews. You know, you can't interview 100 people. Usually you interview, you know, 8, 10, 12, maybe 15. So your sample size is low. Your results are not going to generalize. They're not going to be representative. They're not supposed to be, but they're designed to get in-depth information that can give you insight and on the topic that quantitative studies with larger samples can't do. But it's always helpful to mention that if you're doing a qualitative study, as far as the generalization of your results. And here we're at the summary. So yeah, like any summary of any chapter, recap major points of the chapter. And what's a little different in this one is remind the reader of your research problem and why your study is needed. And if you want, again, check your template. You can end by transitioning to the next chapter. Okay, I'm going to get to questions in a minute. So if you have any questions, you want to start thinking about them. But again, this is who we are. This is our contact information. Again, I want to invite you to make an appointment for a consultation if you just want to talk. No obligation to find out if what we offer is right for you. Okay, I'm going to leave that up. And I do have a question here already. I think it's from the definitions. I'll read it to you. Wouldn't you need to define key terms up front, right at the beginning, rather than late in the intro section under definitions? And you're absolutely correct. And you need to do them both places, actually. So the question, the question was, don't you need to define like your major terms at the beginning? And yeah, so you would do that in the text, right? So if you're near the beginning and you mentioned something that needs definition, you can kind of give a brief definition of it in the text, right? In the narrative of the text. That's absolutely right. You want to do that early. So your reader knows whenever they hit that term, they already know what it means. But then some schools, most schools do want you to have additionally a definition section where they can just go to that section and go, aha, okay, that's what that means. But yes, that is right. Okay, any other questions? Okay. About how many pages do you think the introduction chapter should be, or does it just depend on the topic? It depends on the topic to some degree, but 10 to 20 pages, 12, 15 pages, something like that. It's not a long section or chapter, I'm sorry. Probably 15, I'd say, is kind of the sweet spot. As long as you have, the information that's needed. I would say that's probably 15 is probably. And again, schools may have different requirements, but that's what we see a lot. Okay, any other questions? Everybody's good on the chapter 1? Okay, well, let's see. Oh, at the end of the first paragraph, you said that the reader should. I missed that point. The first section, you mean, at the end of the first section? The reader should have the introduction section. The reader should have a good idea of what your topic is, why you're conducting your study, and how you're going to conduct it. And those are just, at that point, those things aren't going to be worked out at the very beginning, but they should know that. All right. Anybody else? Questions? All right, everybody, I want to thank you all for attending. And remember, we have resources on our website. We have blogs, we have not sample, but guidelines for the chapters. We have webinars archived. And our contact information is there if you do want to make an appointment for a consultation. And we do offer other webinars, so check our calendar to see what we're offering when, and feel free to sign up for whatever you want. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Take care and good luck.